Hey y'all, welcome back to continue our investigation of how metaphysics, religion, spirituality are integrally connected, wrapped up in, explicitly discussed in the works of um, artist messengers, artist prophets, how art is required in order to include um, infinity into human expression, into process and product, and how that abstract world embodies a world including infinity, how it expresses, is perceived, becomes perceivable, comprehends, treats its entities, um, gains its realities and truths in the same way that does a world when it's treated and interacted with in a way which includes infinity. Um, we're gonna get right into it. All many precursors and whatnot have been offered in the past two videos introducing and then beginning this series. So we'll just get into it. So we we touched on the interpretation of 94, Sonnet 94, Shakespeare Sonnet 94, according to um, its interpretation, according to, informed by the awareness of this role that Shakespeare is in, a messenger, somebody passing metaphysical knowledge explicitly, using art as a way to express in an infinity including way, and also therein embodying and confirming in artistic process, in the abstract process, the truths, the wisdom, the implications and justifications of an infinity including world. Um, so we've got number one, our manifestation of infinity that's in our world and is always in our world, which all humans across time and place get to experience, is transition. That's the one we're using for this go through of the sonnets. We're using transition. There's a point in which, at that point in which one thing ends and the other thing begins, there's always a point where it's neither one nor the other. That's a point of bothness or of indefinableness. And those things, bothness and indefinableness or unknowableness of which it was, are all manifestations of infinity. They're ways to justify, paths to understanding or recognizing the existence of infinity and its manifestations in our world. And because these things are, for instance, embodied in the exchange of hands, when you hand something to somebody else and they take it, there's one moment where it's neither one nor the other. It belongs to both, and whether that's an intentional handoff or not, which is why Hermes is the god of thieves. It's that happens whether one person is conscious of it or not, unconscious of it or not, or whether it's of merchants, a handoff, an exchange of hands more than it is thievery or mercantile, um, or from wakeness to sleep, uh, which is why such a god might embody something like that experience. Um, there's a point when you're awake, and it becomes when you're sleeping, and you never know. You can never know. There's one moment where it's neither the one nor the other, but rather both. This indefinableness is something that we recognize when it's really explicitly shown like this. When For instance, there's a moment when you stop being physically alive and start being physically dead. Um, and the psychopomp, like Hermes, there's always a god representing this moment, and this moment represents the transition, the very shareable, understandable, regularly experienced moment in the life experience that all humans share of transition, of this thing which shows that there is this indefinableness. And that if we look a little closer, we'll realize that, oh, all things, because they're always changing from being what they were in one moment to what they are in the next moment, always invariably changing. All things, that we know this, that all things, their irrefutable particularity, what they are exactly, is always changing a little bit. And so we see that there's a transition in all these, and we see that there's indefinableness in all these, though it be less obvious when you look at a leaf. You don't see necessarily that it's changing every moment, but we know that it absolutely is. Um, so we're doing transition. Transitions are our path to infinity. This is something that a religion like the Greek god system might offer through embodying God like Hermes, um, who, if you engage this transition, can also then show you and embody the product that you could become the link between the heaven and earth. That is, if you come into an interaction reflecting the infinity which transition embodies, reflecting reconciliation and consciousness with the infinity that transition embodies, you can come into a degree and type of interaction with the approachable mundane, the world, the earth around you, which reveals limitlessness and infinite potential in its specificness. You can start to pull out by this degree and type of interaction reflecting reconciliation with a metaphysical concept like infinity. You can start to pull out meaning, relationship to this other thing and its ever-changing nature, which is limitless. So in this way, we find the specific and the limitlessness in the specific, and that is the becoming the link between the heavens and the earth, or the immortal and the mortal, or the fairy world and the human world. And that's why Puck and Hermes are all the messengers, the links between the heavens and earth, or the mundane and the infinite, or the mortals and the immortals, or the gods and the humans. Links between the worlds. Other abstract representations um, of such a thing are prayer hands, a point where the two abstract body parts, when considered in the abstract world, meet. There's a point where it's neither one nor the other. That's where they meet, and that embodies the transition, which is a manifestation of infinity again. Again, we mentioned Hermes for the manyth time, and so we'll talk about, in the previous video we mentioned the four implications that are found in a lot of these uh, four important upfront premises and implications of existing in an infinite context, which are referenced and discussed and engaged, and which art is used to discuss, especially in these sonnets. That is that irrefutable particularity or uniqueness is just a way of being irrefutably, particularly, uniquely related to all other things, and being related to all other things in a context in which all of those things are always changing. And so a way of being irrefutably particularly related, which is always changing. And so our irrefutable particularity, our uniqueness, is something that's always changing because it's defined by relationship. The second implication is that in such an infinite plexus, in such an infinite state, all things of every, and according to the previous implication, all things of every type, state, nature, appearance, whatever they are, visible, invisible, matter, energetic, whatever they may be, are have an equally limitless potential for meaning and truth and consequence and value. Um, then that all things of every type, state, nature, again, whatever anything is part of the biggest thing. It's the third implication is that it's part of the most biggest miraculous thing. It's part of God, whatever you want to think, the Brahman, Nirvana. Um, oh, give me 1 second. Yeah, so um, all of these are part of the the greatest, whatever the greatest thing you can think of is. These are all part of it. If we're in an infinite context, they're all part of this greatest, most miraculous, ever changing thing, the thing with the highest potential, whatever it is. We're all part of the same thing, which means we're all also at one. We're not only have miraculous and limitless potential, but we're also all at one. We're part of the same thing. And this makes all things worthy of praise, worthy of selfless, unassuming interaction, worthy of our giving, worthy of all of our energy, of focus, worthy of unconditional love. And the last implication is deathlessness, whether it be the entropic deathlessness, which is that when a physical entity, which arose from this whole physical organism, arose as a high energy state from this whole becomes once it disintegrates, when it reaches its demise, when it stops being a consciousness supporting organism, it doesn't just go nowhere. It returns in different forms. It changes state and returns to the universe. So in this way, there's a deathlessness in entropy when we're in an infinite context. And then also there's in infinity, any type of interaction, again, anything of any type, state, nature, appearance has an equal potential. So any type of interaction is life itself. That is energetic interaction, the sound of a voice, is as real or consequential as um, uh, um, the slap of the hand. And so any type of interaction is life itself. Then if we were to take our thought, which is the energy inside of our mind, which is as real, again, in a place where all things of every type, state, and nature have an equally limitless potential. So the energy of our thought, is the same as the physical self, or at least is equivalent to it. It's as much our self as our body is our self. And so if we are to record, to write down, or record in any other way, to notate our unique thoughts, and those come into an interaction in posterity beyond our physical death, then we are truly alive and interacting there. And that's the immortality in the written word. So let's get right into just for the sake of having a little bit on 29, and we will, of course, develop 94 more later, just to give you a couple fun um, things to investigate that are relevant to this, a couple moments to interpret, to look more deeply and selflessly into in 29, that are relevant to, that are informed by this awareness that Shakespeare is acting as a voice, a messenger of metaphysical knowledge that has pervaded all religions and spiritualities, that he's using the abstract world because he needs to in order to include infinity into product of process. I'm just gonna offer you a couple points to look into and investigate yourself, so that you might have a even more nourishing experience, more informing experience than you would otherwise. So he says, when in disgrace, Sonnet 29, when in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, I alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least. Yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising, from soul and earth sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered, such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. As with all of these, this really, really points out, focuses on a point, a moment in the process, the metaphysical journey. It shows himself, he describes himself at a point in the metaphysical journey, what it can feel like when you are in the process of reconciling infinity and consciousness, what is needed, what to remember, what happens when you lack it, the state of self when it lacks. So let's just jump in and touch on a couple excerpts. So first of all, disgrace and fortune are explicitly showing us we're discussing this larger context, this metaphysical, this fundamental essential, these fundamental essential aspects of life. Then he says in the second line, I all alone, really, he could have just said I alone, I all alone beweep my outcast state. We have to start to recognize that he's pointing out immediately that misfortune, or a sense of badness, or a sense of separation from others, comes from being all alone. When we weep, when we are sad, When we feel outcast or isolated, this is because we are all alone. And this harkens back to the implications. Our truth, who we are, our uniqueness, our irrefutable particularity, is a way of being related, an albeit never changing way of being related or connected to all other things. And troubled deaf heaven with my bootless cries. So, this heaven, again, here's, I always also point out explicit variables chosen by the artist to make us know irrefutably that this is our subject matter. We're talking about metaphysics. We're talking about the essential nature of humanity and the God that they created in order to, for some function. What's the function of religion? Um, Troubling deaf heaven with bootless cries. This is what we do when we scream out in fear. We make heaven deaf. We make our cries are bootless. They're unfounded and ungrounded. When we cry alone, when we focus inward, when we weep our outcast state, this is the ego fearing. This is a sense of isolation, and we're not talking to heaven. Because heaven is infinity. This is a concept within that can make us not fear and not feel isolated. Um, this would be the one that instead of crying a be weeping an outcast state, was able to generate from within the justification for not being all alone, for reaching out and finding that that wasn't the case. And he goes on and shows, and Shakespeare repeatedly, and we'll see in the other sonnets, uses the difference between upon and into, to look upon and to look into something as a major variable in relationship for how to interact with things, to show that there's a distinct degree or way that we can interact with the world around us. He says, and look upon myself. Looking upon is a superficial looking versus looking into. Looking upon something as it looks on the surface. And he says, look upon myself and curse my fate. So this is still, he's showing the antithesis of holding and having reconciled the thing. He's showing the part of the process where it hasn't worked yet. He knows he wants something. He doesn't want to be all alone. He doesn't want to be outcast. He wants to be connected. He wants to have fortune. But at this point, he still looks upon, um, he's looking upon, superficially upon himself. So he's not actually seeing himself either. He's just looking upon the surface. This is a sense of isolation, giving you immediate ego fear and seeking a sense of immediate gratification for fate or fortune in men's eyes. He wants to be like others. It's a sense of jealousy. Um, uh, Again, superficial, just wanting an immediate solution. He wants to be featured like him. He wants to possess friends instead of other forms, instead of more connected forms of friendship than possession, desiring this man's art and that man's scope. So he's looking at things that are already consciousness and wanting these, and where we'll find out that the truth, what we really seek, our uniqueness, is never changing thing, and so it's something we can't intend, something we don't know in consciousness, but rather what we really seek is something that can be revealed. With what I most enjoy, contented least. And so we see that this true connection, all of these things that he thinks he's seeking to be like the other people, or to be accepted by them, or uh, to be more rich in hope or something like that. But then he goes on, yet in these thoughts myself almost despising. And there we have a nice Shakespearean duality so often presented. In these thoughts that were presented, the antithetical self or semi self, as it is in ego fear, in a sense of youthful isolation, um, knowing about fortune, knowing about heaven, but not yet engaging them. The ego just sort of screaming to them, looking upon itself, focusing inward, being all alone, and grasping for trying to possess things. And so he shows, yet in these thoughts, the antithetical thoughts, myself almost despising. So he knows that it's wrong that he's doing this. He doesn't know yet why. He doesn't quite have autonomous justification of why. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising. And we see he's saying that himself, he almost hates himself. It's a sense of self hatred, but self contempt. But we also see that the second meaning here is myself almost. He's the thing that he despises is not himself. So we see that this is also a discussion of self, what it is to be the self, what it is to be an individual, or what it is to be unique, what it is to be irrefutably particular. And we see that when you're all alone, this antithetical first self, the superficial self, this self that knows heaven exists but has not yet understood how demystified it, made it usable, made it the function that it is for becoming, um, and becoming nourished and becoming human. He still is almost himself. And then we move in the positive direction, the transition happens. Haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising. And again, here he thinks on thee, and we wonder, is this a message bearer? Is this God? Is this infinity? Is this the main subject? We're not given who it is, and I think that's a big part. It's whatever makes him feel most connected. It's whatever makes him feel completely nourished. It's the thing we're talking about. The, said once, and said in a context where heaven um, is mentioned not only once, but again coming up. And we see it's also the thing that makes him find likeness, shared reality. In the previous video, I talked about this, but it's when we come into that selfless interaction, reflecting reconciliation of infinity and consciousness. When we come into the selfless, unassuming, praising interaction with anything around us, we reveal, as a consciously witnessable thought result, that way that we are irrefutably, particularly meaningfully related or connected or identify self with the other only in that moment. So you could look at the same rock, the same tree, the same whatever it is, and no matter what, in the next moment, you'll have, assuming you're selfless, assuming you're reflecting in a state of mind, reflecting, having reconciled and justified infinity and consciousness, you will reveal a new truth, a new way of being meaningfully connected, of identifying imaginatively with the other. And what this does is it shows in a certain moment, ever changing moments, that which you and the other thing were when you were selflessly connected only in that moment. And that's not only a newness, which redefines yourself, the self and the other, but it's also something that you share. It's the you as you were when you were selflessly connected, and it's the that as it was when it was selflessly connected with you. And that is a truth which is shared by both, and so it transforms the one into the other. It gives you a likeness to the other. It's a way of identifying with it. And this is why, again, we see this type of selfless giving, which infinity, the metaphysical message being taught, leads to likeness. Happily, I think on the end, then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising. It is this thing that he's showing is our goal. This finding likeness to others, not just to other men and artists and people that we admire, but to anything and everything. It's showing us that there's a greater set of resources for this rebirth, break of day arising. It's when we can find likeness to everything that we're not yearning and grabbing for possession in a sense of immediate removal from isolation from other people's, from other, things that are just like us, people that are in our neighborhood, but rather that we could find this likeness, what we seek. We cannot be beweeped all alone and looking upon yourself, but rather find what we seek, um, with what I most with what I most enjoy contented least. We find that thing that we most enjoy by this when we think on thee, on infinity, and then our state becomes like to other things. We find likeness, just like in 94, we find likeness to the stone, like to the lark at break of day, from soul in earth. That is this potential for earth to not have, limitless, for the potential, the specific, when it doesn't have infinity in it, when we define it as one thing out of our fear because we're looking to ourselves. Soul and earth sings hymns at heaven's gate. So suddenly we have approached using and engaging heaven, infinity. We've made it usable. We've made it approachable. We've realized that if we think about the implications of infinity, we could begin to use it, to engage it, to come into and recognize the limitlessness in the specific, heaven on earth. So the earth suddenly begins to sing, to speak to us. This is the consciously perceivable manner of our being, irrefutably particularly connected to anything else when we begin to act according to the implications of infinity. It begins to speak to us. Our shared truth that's ever changing begins to be revealed. This is again the Holy Spirit, or the air as it is when treated and as all other things are treated, sacred. Um, and then he finishes, "For thy sweet love remembered, such wealth brings. Thy sweet love," and this is the unconditional love that arises. That's an implication of infinity. Such wealth brings. Again, we're redefining, we're seeing how the entire world is redefined, whether it be nature or people or self or life or death. All things are redefined in light of this principle. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. Suddenly we realize that all these things, these types of power, these types of wealth which were actually immediate gratification, this just suddenly possessing somebody else's ability or suddenly possessing someone else's friends, these would have been unsustainable. These would have been non-unique manners of getting what would content us most. In fact, what we seek is likeness to all things, to find our irrefutably particular way of being connected and related to all things. And the path to this is this sweet unconditional love, which comes when we think on thee, when we think on infinity, when we recognize that it's there, that it's that it's manifest in the world, that it's in the transition, that it's in the duality, in the paradox, in the boldness, in the limitlessness, in the ever changing nature of things, and then begin to follow the implications of this and justify reconciling consciousness, this metaphysical context, which can then allow us to come into a state of mind which comes into autonomously into a degree and type of interaction with the world around us, which is truly nourishing, which is true wealth, which reveals our likeness to all things and a limitless one, the limitlessness in the specific. Thanks for joining the School of Smirk for another synthesis of art and religion. Shakespeare, Sonnet 29.